Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about how I studied for the MCAT. If you're curious, this was my score and my percentile and the breakdown of the score. In this channel, I'm going to be making videos about the entire medical school application process from taking the MCAT to primary to secondary applications to interviewing in hopes that I can give some insight into my experience and how it might apply to yours. Alright, so to give you an idea of where I am, I took the MCAT at the end of May of this year, and I started studying vaguely around a year ago today. So what I recommend for how to start, if you're in the same point as me and you haven't started studying yet, as far as when you take the MCAT, I recommend that you take it right after your most important classes. So those would be Gen Chem, Organic Chem, Biochem, Physics, Psychology, Sociology. Those are the main ones that you'll want to have taken. And so once you finish those classes, you're going to want to take the MCAT right away so that all of that information is as fresh in your mind as possible. One thing that I really recommend you do prior to starting to study for the MCAT is to get really good at reading scientific research papers. If that's something you struggle with, that's essentially all that the MCAT is. You're interpreting figures and trying to take all the information out of them that you can. And they give you a multiple choice question about it. So if that's not your strong suit, I recommend that you get a lot of experience dissecting thoroughly, like cell biology research papers. Alright, so my study schedule was split into a period of about 4 to 6 months before the exam. I started doing content review. And then about a month before the exam, I did a lot of practice tests. About every other day, I would take a practice test or a set of questions from the AAMC and get really good at taking the test, because that's honestly a big part of it. You can know all the content but not be good at taking the test in the style that it is, and you will not do as well. So for that 4 to 6 months before your test, you should get a hold of the resources that you are going to use. Personally, I recommend getting 4 things. You need to get a set of review books, so like the Kaplan books or the Princeton review books or any type of books, as long as they come with their own practice tests, which I will explain how to use in a bit. And then you will also want to familiarize yourself with Khan Academy. Khan Academy has this whole section of MCAT videos that were made by the AAMC, and the AAMC is the one who makes the test. So those are going to be the most important set of information that you can use, especially for like psychology and sociology, where they could pull from a lot of different information, but they decided to pull what they did, and that's all going to be in those Khan Academy videos. Now, if you're like me, then you don't like watching all of the videos because you might already know half the information in the video, and you'll be wasting your time. Luckily, there is a site called Reddit. Reddit is an online forum site if you're not familiar with it, and it has a whole, what they call a subreddit devoted to the MCAT. And on this subreddit, there are wonderful people who have taken notes from all of the Khan Academy videos, taken all the information out of them, and put them into a document. And that's what I recommend using to study primarily. You should be using that because that is strictly from the AAMC, and that is what they're going to test you on. And then the 4th resource is you'll need to buy the AAMC practice test materials. Buy the entire set. It comes with, I believe, 4 full-length practice tests, 1 half-length practice test, and a lot of problem banks and question sets that were made by the AAMC, so you know that that is going to be exactly like what is going to be on the test. Okay, so now you have your resources. You have your set of books that comes with the own practice tests. You're familiar with Khan Academy. You're familiar with Reddit and where to find that document. I'll put the link down below. And you have bought the AAMC official practice materials. So the first thing that I recommend you do is to familiarize yourself with the test. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to take the Kaplan test or the Princeton Review practice test. And the point of this is you need to know what you're studying for. So you need to know how long it is, how many questions it is, what the questions will look like, a vague idea of what the content will be, and what kind of breaks you have, and what kind of stamina you'll need to build up to do well on this test. And it's important to not worry about your score on this first test because you haven't started reviewing content, you just need to know what the test is like. Alright, so now that you know the basic content areas, you need to make a list of what you don't know. And it's very important throughout this process that you are aware of what you don't know, because that's what you'll be studying. If you know something well, and you can prove that on a test, then you don't need to be studying that. You need to be studying the stuff you don't know. For me, I didn't really know anything about psychology and sociology, and there were a lot of new terms that I needed to learn by the time I would take the MCAT, so that's where I spent a lot of my time. I had just taken biochem and physics and some upper level chemistry, so that section of the MCAT was not where I spent my time. I spent my time on certain biology topics and certain psychology and sociology topics. Okay, so now you know what you don't know. You have a list of that. That's what you're going to begin doing the content review. For a lot of people, that's like an entire subject. For me, it was the behavioral book. So I spent a lot of time reading through the Kaplan behavioral book and watching pretty much all of the Khan Academy videos from the psychology and sociology sections because I knew that I didn't know anything. And if that's not what you want to do, then maybe you go through the Reddit document. But you need to decide what works for you, and you'll figure that out along the way. So say you really don't remember anything from biochem. It was a really long time ago. You're going to need to go through and review probably the entire biochem book or the entire biochem section on Khan Academy. And throughout this period, as you're reviewing all those things, I recommend that you take another Kaplan test about a third of the way through, and then take another Kaplan test about 2/3 of the way through this content review period. And through those, you'll be able to gauge, okay, now I understand this. I guess I thought I understood this, but I don't. And you can modify your list of what you should be studying. Okay, so at this point, you've done your 6 months of content review, 4 to 6 months of content review, and now you're ready to start the 4 to 5 weeks of really intense studying for the MCAT. And you have 3 goals during this last month or so. Your first goal is to train your body and your mind to have the stamina to take this test. Your second goal is to build the content knowledge way further in depth than you ever had, so you know exactly specific details that you will need to be tested on. The third goal is to learn all the test-taking strategies that you'll need to use to do as well as possible on the test. So within the first goal, to train your mind and body to have the stamina, what you're going to do is you're going to set your sleep schedule to be exactly what it will be for the actual test day. And you're going to be waking up that way for at least 4 to 5 weeks. And so you will be so used to waking up at that time that it won't affect you at all on the actual test day. So if you're in a situation where you have to drive an hour to get to your test location, you might have to wake up at 5:30 every day for a month. But realistically, if you're setting aside this whole month to study, then it won't really affect you because you won't have a lot of other commitments. So the first part is setting your sleep schedule. The second part of that is taking practice tests every other day where you are following the exact timeline that you would for your actual MCAT. So you need to be spending 8 hours from about 7:30 in the morning to about 3:30 in the afternoon where you are directly working on practice problems or a practice test. Now the way I recommend spacing this out, I can link my study schedule down below. So I started out with the first practice test from AAMC to get an idea of what score I would get had I taken the MCAT on that day. I recommend doing that first so that you can set kind of your expectations and your goals for this next month. And then about halfway through the month, on one of those days, you're going to take the second AAMC practice test and gauge your progress with the score it gives you. And then right at the end of your study, you can take the last AAMC practice test and it will give you the most realistic idea of what your score is going to be, because you're going to be, after you take the real thing, waiting a month to get your score back. And it's going to be agonizing, but if you want to have an idea of what your score is going to look like, then that third practice test right before you take the real thing is going to be your most accurate reflection. And mine was within 1 point of what I actually got on the MCAT, so I would say that that's a really good way to measure where you're going to end up. Okay, so I said take those 3 practice tests, but I also said you're going to need to take a practice test every other day, spending a day taking the test and then a day reviewing, and then taking another test and a day reviewing. But you only have 3 practice tests. What are you going to do? What I recommend is taking the official question sets that AAMC provides and going through them as if they are a practice test. So you will be taking like the chemistry section, which is probably 120 questions, and then following it by a cars section, and doing that over and over, not necessarily with the right content areas to recreate an actual test, but just making sure you go through 120 questions every half day. And what this does is it builds your stamina. Even if you're not getting the actual test recreated, you're training your body to be working on problems from 7:30 to 3:30 every day, and through that you're also learning the information. And I will link what I did personally for my study schedule below. So that brings me to big goal 2 of this month period, is you need to get really good at all of the content that's going to be on this test. There is so much content that's on the MCAT between psychology, sociology, biology, all of those classes. You'll need to know essentially all of the information from all of them to do as well as possible on this test. And the way you know what you need to study the most is through those practice tests. Remember I said you need to take a day to review after each practice test? What you're doing in those is when you took the practice test, you're going to flag all the questions where you don't know the answer. And then when you go back through, you're going to look at all your flag questions, which you guessed on and didn't know the overarching concept, and all the questions you missed, which you also didn't know the overarching concept or you read the question wrong. Either way, you need to make a more detailed list of things you don't know. And for the second goal of learning the content in really great depth, one tip that I have is when you're going through the practice test and you don't know how to do an answer, copy the question into Google, and 9 times out of 10, a Reddit page will pop up where someone has asked that exact same question, they don't understand it, and someone has graciously answered it for them on Reddit. There might be an explanation for the answer given by the test maker. It's usually not very good, and if you go to Reddit, then they can explain a lot more in depth why the answer is what it is. An important thing is that when you look at a question, don't just memorize the answer to a question, memorize all of the surrounding facts that you might need to know for that question. So say you missed a question about glycolysis, you don't know which enzyme catalyzes the first step of glycolysis, and you missed that question on a practice test. When you see that you missed that question, you should realize, wow, I don't know all the steps of glycolysis very well, I should study all of them, rather than just that one step, because that one question probably is never going to show up again, but the question about the second step of glycolysis might. And that's what I recommend doing for all the sections. Get to know all the content. One exception to that is cars, where it's impossible to know any of the content. That brings me to the third main goal of this month period, which is to learn the test-taking strategies to do extremely well on the test. That applies to all the sections, not just cars, but it's most evident in cars because you can't actually memorize information for cars. So what I did was I looked on Reddit for some tips for people who it seemed like they thought like me. And I will link down below the post that really helped me the most, which gave the tip of taking a 5 to 10 second break between each passage. So each passage, you'll read the passage and then you'll have questions to answer on it, probably 6 or 7 questions per passage. And then once you finish that passage, you're going to be thinking about it for a while unless you stop and take a break and think about nothing for 5 seconds before you start reading the next passage. And it really helps to clear your mind so you aren't thinking about past questions while you're working on the questions you need to be thinking about now. And I think that that was the most effective strategy that I had ever come across for taking a test in general. And the test-taking strategies don't just apply to cars, they also apply to all of the other sections. And the way you develop these is through taking the practice test. You realize what works for you and what doesn't. If you start realizing, wow, I just really didn't think through this question and I just completely missed it for no good reason, and I knew the answer, then you're going to need to come up with a strategy where you look at a question, and even if you don't know the answer right away, you keep trying. And that's really what separates good test takers from bad ones. A lot of the questions on my actual MCAT and all my practice tests, I didn't know the answer right away. I had no clue how I was going to start it. But I didn't let that stop me. I took 5 seconds and was like, okay, what do I know? And how can I apply it to this situation? And a lot of the times, it leads me to at least an educated guess that gives me a 90% confidence that the answer I chose is the correct answer. And that's how you get through the test. Not through necessarily knowing all the content, but being able to eliminate it based on things you already know, even if you don't really see the answer right away. And my final recommendation is to not just use one source for all of your test-taking tips. Look at all the different videos on the internet, look at all the Reddit posts. If you are struggling to come up with a strategy that works for you, there is someone else who has struggled with that and overcome it. I know a lot of people who struggled with knowing the answer but not putting the right one down for whatever reason, and through practicing and practicing, they overcame it. So like I said, this last month where you are really integrating your stamina and your content and your test-taking strategies into one is by far the most important part of your studying, and this is what will probably increase your score at least 10 points. That's the common trend that I've seen is when people start, they take the practice test, they get 10 points lower than what they will at the end of that month when they actually take the test. So I hope this video has been helpful and that it gives you some insight into how to attack this test properly, and I will put all of the resources I mentioned, linked to them down below if that is something you're interested in.